All right, guys, welcome back to Discovering Eden. My name is Brandon,
And I'm Jonathan.
and you may have noticed things have changed a little bit,
Just a little.
just a little bit. Changed up the angle of the camera, and well, we got a different camera, so it's not as fuzzy. But hopefully, you guys enjoy it. But anyway, as we get into goodness, we're gonna start off with prayer, and then we'll get into the bumper. This time, I'm gonna remember the bumper, and we'll get right into it. So I'm gonna take us into prayer. So, dear God, I thank you that we're able to do something like this, that we're able to speak about you and be able to talk about you and your word in a way that people can listen and interact with the different things that you have to say. And I just want to be clear that whatever is from you would be lifted high and highlighted, and then whatever is from us that would follow the ground, be forgotten, because what you have for us is what is most important. And for goodness, I pray that you would help us to define that and explore it in ways that would be helpful for others who are listening. And I just pray that you be with us as we record. And I pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right. The bumper. All right.
That was a great bumper. I feel revitalized and
It was a
refreshed.
good bumper, right?
It was a good bumper.
It was a good bumper.
The tally starts. So, as we kind of explore goodness, obviously, you guys know the drill at this point. We're going to give our own definitions before we dive into the lovely Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of goodness. So I guess I can start with mine. And I told Brandon ahead of time, it's been a week. So my preps, especially today, is very light. So we're flying by the seat of our pants today. So when I look at goodness, especially from a biblical perspective, I reflect on it more as, and this is, we talked about it a little bit last week, where it's, it can be kind of hard to separate, from kindness at some points, because I do think there is a compassionate and merciful part to goodness. But then you also have the righteous side of it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, when you look at, the goodness of God, you see this perfect righteousness, this perfect compassion, this perfect mercy, all that kind of stuff. Whereas, then you've got, well, how does it human being, kind of emulate that? Well, it's obviously imperfect. But, we can try to be righteous in our actions. We can try to be compassionate and merciful. Doesn't mean it's always going to play out perfectly, but again, it goes back into that calling of this is what we're called to do, is to live as Christ-like as possible. It's not always flawless, but that's kind of a tangent. But yeah, so very basic definition of goodness would be kind of that. I'd lean more into that righteousness side, but I do think there is that compassion and that merciful aspect of it too.
Yeah, like you, my definition would have to go more in the line of righteous and holiness.
Sure.
So obviously, when Jesus and God, like when they're talking about like goodness, or especially I think of like Genesis, the book of Genesis, right at the beginning, and it's like, and God saw that it was good.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what does good mean in that sense? It means like perfect,
Sure.
holy, different things like that. So in my mind, goodness is an exemplification of holiness, though obviously imperfect. for the people that enact it. But goodness in and of itself is a quote unquote perfect term. So as perfect as you can make it out to be.
Yeah. Which, you know, I think is something that we have talked about in several episodes. Like, we're looking at these definitions from a biblical standpoint. So you're looking at it from an eternal, you know, perfect standard, which obviously we as humans don't fully comprehend and obviously can't live up to.
Well, and it makes me think, because everybody like, well, how would you define good or goodness? Well, everybody, I think, would go to good versus evil. So what is good? We kind of understand evil is bad and all that kind of stuff. But what does good mean?
It's the hero,
It's the hero.
it's
the
your
thing that fights
Superman,
against
you
it.
know, versus, you know, whatever.
So it's positivity. It's all those kind of things. But you boil it down to it, and obviously, I wouldn't think of it first as perfect.
Sure.
Because
Especially-
especially when you think of a hero, because most heroes aren't perfect.
Yeah, especially in like our own media that we consume, the most compelling heroes are the ones with flaws. But that's neither here nor there, obviously.
But I would be remiss to not mention like the fact that people would think of good in that way. And obviously there's the other definition of good, which is like, hey, how are you doing today? Good.
Life's good.
Kind of like so, kind of in that vein of, it's not spectacular, but it's also not horrible.
Sure.
Because that's also an idea I have for like good, because sometimes when you're like, hey, how was everything today? Like after the test, how do you think you did? Good. Instead of, oh, I did great, I aced it, or no, I flunked it.
I did good.
I did good. That's why, like, for me, when you hear like, oh, it's the goodness of God, I'm like, what's so good about good?
Sure.
Sometimes that's what I think, because I'm like, well, what does goodness even mean? If you're like, wow, okay, that's good. Everything's like, if anything, I'm like, why not great? The greatness of God. That seems better than good. Because what would you rather have on your test score? A great score or a good score?
Sure.
But again, that's a different type of good. So obviously the goodness that we're talking about is more of the righteous actions, or the holiness, perfection kind of thing,
Sure.
which is a little bit different. But the other also, I feel, has a factor in how we perceive goodness.
Absolutely.
So anyway, without further ado, Webster's.
All right. So they've got 3 definitions here. The quality or state of being good. Nice.
Wow, nice.
Uh,
Or should I say good?
Used interjectionally or in phrases especially to express mild surprise or shock, such as, oh my goodness, or goodness knows. These are terrible. And
What
this
about
one,
goodness gracious? That'd be better.
and this one is beautiful. The nutritious, flavorful, or beneficial part of something.
Nutritious? It's
Um,
good for you.
So the last couple weeks I've gone to, like, instead of kindness, we had to go to kind.
So you'll have to go to good. Yeah.
So so we're gonna do that. And see what they have here. Oh, they've got a lot.
Shocker.
Yeah. Of a favorable character or tendency, bountiful or fertile, handsome or attractive, free from injury or disease, not depreciated, commercially sound, something that can be relied on, agreeable, pleasant, wholesome, amusing, clever, of a noticeable large size or quantity, used as a word that gives force or emphasis to a statement, well-founded, true, deserving of respect, legally valid or effectual, adequate. I hate all of these. Liking only things that are of good quality.
Yeah, that's more of the adequate.
Okay,
Okay,
here's
more of the
virtuous, right, commendable, kind, benevolent, competent, loyal, free from infirmity or sorrow.
And honestly, with all these quote unquote definitions, they don't know what it is either.
And again, it's like I said, I hate those definitions, but it's not, again, because I think they're necessarily incorrect from, just linguistic, standpoint. Yes, something that is healthy for you is good. It's nutritious and beneficial. I get what they're saying.
I feel like they use it almost as like a shoe-in for
Oh,
I have no idea what else to put here. What's good for you? Oh, why do we use good? Oh, it's because that's the first thing we think
Sure.
of using.
And I think that's absolutely what they were doing. It is a shoe-in word, or at least that's what it's become.
Just like the response of everybody when you're trying to have a conversation, or maybe you're not trying. Maybe that's the new greeting of, "Hey, how are you doing today?" "Good." Why is that the first thing that we think of, oh, this is going to be my shoe-in answer and reply to something that's happening. So how's your day going? Oh, it's been a little rough lately. No, that's a little too long-winded. You just have to keep it 4 letters. Good. Even if it's not good. Good.
Yeah, you don't want people to know you're struggling.
Typical Midwest.
Oh yeah, everything's great.
Oh, don't you know?
Don't you know?
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I mean, it's definitely become a shoe-in word. So again, when we look at like the biblical definition of it, the biblical definition isn't a shoe-in at all.
Especially when that's God's, response to creating like all of creation. Like on each day, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. When humanity's made, it's very good.
Mm-hmm. It's very much
It's an emphasis
Yeah.
on like that perfection. It's God being pleased with himself.
It's not him saying, "Oh, it's fine. It's good. Whatever."
It's not the throwaway term that
this is good. It's
and it's a little bit hard to grasp considering my perspective of good is that adequate kind of shoe in, you throw it in.
Well, I even think of like reviews on like a 10-point scale.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Good is what? 6, 7?
Good is like 5.
Well, 5 I'd say is
average. It's average, my bad.
6 I'd be like
6 is good.
Good. 7 maybe. 6 could be okay if that's really, what's the difference, but
just like bad is almost just as much of a throwaway in term.
I'm bad. Okay.
Yeah, they have good versus evil. It's not good versus bad. It's just there's a level of like, okay, what is good?
Mm-hmm. Well, because evil, when you look at it in that context, is much more definitive.
Yeah,
at least in our
it's much more like line in the sand or line in concrete or whatever you want to call it. And yet good is kind of this weird middle ground grayscale.
Well, yeah, I mean, yikes.
Anyway, so I'm going to go into the character of the Bible that I think embodies goodness. And honestly, it was kind of a challenging thing to think about.
Sure.
Because especially if you link that to, holiness, righteousness, kind of as close to perfect as you can get. Obviously, we're going to refrain from saying Jesus or God because it's kind of a cop-out answer a little bit. Not that it's wrong. It's
probably the most right answer.
Probably
no. It is the most probably
the right answer. But I kind of want to highlight different biblical characters
as we have been every week.
Yeah. And so the first person that came to mind for me, and I also thought of people that I've already talked about on the show or the podcast,
and we can dive into those too.
Yeah. And I would say my first thought was Job. And why Job? So Job was someone that was blameless in God's eyes, which is huge. Because for you to be blameless, like that's about as little as sin as you could possibly do. Because Job never blamed God for all the crud that was happening to him. Basically,
let's go into kind of the basis of the story a little bit for context.
So basically, the devil asks God's permission. Hey, can I mess with your guy who's, he's blameless in you're blameless in your eyes? Let me see if I can tinker around with him and mess him up.
Basically, under the pretense that the devil's like, I can screw this guy up.
I can sway
him
him
against you. Yeah.
And God's like, yeah, go ahead. And reading the book, you're like, what? Why would God do that? Why would he just like, oh yeah, have at it? So basically, Job goes through like a living hell. It's children die. A lot of his possessions are gone. The wife basically leaves him. I say basically because, but through it all, Job never blamed God through all of it. And obviously he has his friends that come alongside him, but they also are a little bit wrong as well in their stances as to, because they're like, oh, you must have done some sin and you can't, it must have been something you did and you just never repented or anything for it. But he's like, I didn't do anything, so but his friends were almost used by the devil as well to like do it. And basically the book of Job is basically Job going back and forth between different perspectives that he was given. So you have Job in his perspectives with his friends. You also have Job experiencing everything that's the calamity and everything that's going around him. And also his back and forth with God. And obviously God through it is saying, am I not greater than fill in the blank? And basically Job's like, I'm all in. I'm all yours. It's like the greatest example of like total surrender. And obviously there's a little bit of, especially with the end of the book of Job, there's a little bit of controversy as to, oh, well, it was penned a little bit later, so maybe it was added later to give it a happy ending. Oh, he got everything back that he once lost, but like double fold. Saying, oh, if you like, it kind of like the prosperity gospel kind of thing comes to mind for me. It's like, which for the book of Job, I think it's more impactful.
Sure.
If the other part didn't happen. So if he remained at everything was taken. And yet still finding solace, still finding that peace, still finding the good that was in the situation, even if you didn't get it back. Even if you would never get back to what you had before. Because all of that is nothing in comparison to God, which is the ultimate goodness, I guess, if I were to put it that way. But that's Job. That's why I think Job.
Yeah. And I went a lot more simple. And we had a little bit of a conversation beforehand, so I do want to dive into that because I think I'm going with a story that everybody knows. And more focused on a very, I think it's a core aspect of the story. But you mentioned something that was something I didn't think about ahead of time, and it's an interesting perspective that I don't think a lot of people out of context would necessarily know, and so
It brings something a little bit into the conversation,
which I think is I want to talk about, but we'll get to that after. So I went with Noah. Again, story is everybody knows the story of the flood, Noah's Ark. World's falling apart, and God decides we're going to start over. I'm going to start over, and he decides to save Noah. Noah was the one righteous person among this disaster that's going on. And so, he has them build the ark. Everybody knows the story. It takes, two of each animal on the ark. We get the flood. And
Olive branch, all that.
Olive branch, the whole shebang. The reason I went with Noah is, again, focusing in on that. He was the one righteous person that God saw amongst the mess. And this is where it kind of diverts, where Brandon and I had a conversation before the episode aired. Maybe we should record our conversations beforehand, but he brought up an interesting perspective that I didn't think about. And so I want to kind of toss it to you and kind of give, because you mentioned a couple, I'll just let you kind of go into it. Because it's interesting. I think the aspect of righteousness, where he was spared, is that's good, But then you brought up something very interesting.
Now, I can't take credit for this because I heard it elsewhere. So
give a little backstory.
I can't remember exactly where I heard it.
Okay.
But I almost want to say it was on my trip when I was in Israel.
I figured when you said you mentioned a rabbi.
So it's more of a Jewish background and Jewish tradition.
Sure.
For a rabbinical kind of belief. And why was Abraham looked on so favorably and Moses and yet not Noah?
Yeah.
So you have like your almost Mount Rushmore, let's say, of
Old Testament figures.
characters. So you have Elijah, you have Abraham, you have Moses, like all those people, and those are the kind of the people that show up at like the Transfiguration.
Yes,
those kinds of people. Yet not Noah, even though he was the most righteous.
He was considered the most righteous in that time.
In that time. So why not him? So the thing that they go to, the rabbis, I don't know who rabbi what.
Yeah.
I was probably told, I just don't remember. Is Abraham fought for the people in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
Saying, what if there's one? What if there's 10?
Right. Will you spare the city?
Will you spare the city, God? Whereas Noah does not do that.
Sure. It's kind of what you said before we aired. It's, okay, I'll do this thing.
Okay, I'll do it. I'm not thinking about anybody else, but I'll do what you say. Because I revere you. It's not necessarily a wrong option. It's just there's something that Abraham did that there's a little bit more that could have been done.
Which
like,
I think
where's that fight back?
And that's something that I didn't think about when, again, minimal preparation, but I just went, oh, he was he was spared because God saw him as righteous in that time in history. So that's where my mind went. But I thought that was an interesting perspective.
Like, it was only him and his family.
Yeah.
In the book, there's no mention, like in Genesis, there's no mention of him talking to anybody else. Nothing. You almost get more of the talking to everybody else in like Bruce Almighty. Like, seriously, though.
Yeah.
You get more talking and interaction with other people of the world in like Bruce Almighty, which is a satire.
Yeah.
Which, when I think about it, I'm like, that's right. It doesn't talk about anybody else. Because he kind of was in his own bubble. Which, to me, which is why I wouldn't say exemplifies that holiness standard.
Sure.
Because though it is kind of a good thing to listen to God, it's also he could have done more, and it's in the heart of God to share that with others.
Sure.
So why he's not in that pantheon of big names of the Bible is because I feel he doesn't do that. So that's why, Noah is lesser and, realized than all the other.
Kind of less revered than
Yeah.
your Abraham or Moses. Which, again, after hearing your explanation, your perspective on it, totally can see it. But I think, again, just looking at it from a baseline perspective.
Yeah, and for these videos, I try to keep them pretty tame, especially as we start off, because I don't want to get into the deep nitty gritty for a lot of these things too quickly.
And it doesn't mean we haven't before. I know you've thrown out some crazy names before. I know for one of them, I did the thief on the cross, which is one that I don't think people would have necessarily jumped to. I don't remember which one.
But we're sprinkling it in
here and there. But for the most part, we like to keep that baseline.
Because eventually this podcast will go a lot deeper. It will go into we'll actually be reading scripture,
right?
Going through these
and
things.
We'll be able to dive deeper into some of these conversations, like what we just did here, where Brandon's attended seminary. I have a bachelor's in ministry, didn't do seminary, but
there's more than I let on.
We can go much deeper, but we want to start as this is a nice introduction to.
This is an introduction, and one thing I was actually thinking of is I wanted to revisit this later down the road,
like the life redefined sort of thing.
Yeah, redefine the redefinitions.
So go even deeper,
to go into the more depths.
So you guys have that to look forward to. Life Redefined 2.0 version 2.
Yeah, so that, and obviously there's going to be everybody has flaws in the Bible other than Jesus and God.
Right.
But there was a couple other characters that I wanted to bring up because my dad and I were talking about it, and we were we share the same brain cell. So we're thinking of the same kind of people. And one of them that I thought up of that is kind of more off the beaten trail, lesser known, was Ruth. Also toward that goodness. Because my dad's bringing it up. I'm like, yeah, Ruth. I'm like, yeah, I thought about that, but I already used Ruth for something. So I'm like, I don't want to use it again. But there are people that, you can double down on some of these characters.
I've noticed that too, because I know you used Job today, but I feel like one of us used Job
I think
earlier.
Job was potentially used earlier.
I can't remember 100%. It's been, there's a lot of names, but it goes to show that a lot of these individuals represent obviously
different
multiple qualities, and again that kind of plays into their living, their life and service.
Yeah,
of God.
There's so I was thinking also of, well, when my dad and I were talking, we were talking about, okay, what about the people that never died? So people that ended up getting taken up into heaven without dying.
Sure.
Would they be classified as good? So my dad and I were throwing out names like Enoch, which is obviously that's Genesis as well. I don't know a whole lot about Enoch. Enoch isn't really talked about all that much in the Bible as we know it. Obviously, there's the Book of Apocrypha, the Book of Enoch, different things like that. I haven't read it. I don't know what's in it. But
it's not considered part of the biblical canon,
Yeah, so I wasn't going to talk into depth about that.
And maybe that's something we could talk about later down the line as just a conversation. But again, those books aren't considered canonical for various reasons. So
I almost wanted to bring up Elijah.
Elijah's a good one too.
Obviously, he's known for more of the Mount Carmel. This is my sacrifice. Light it up. But I hesitated a little bit because he showed fear of Jezebel.
Sure.
And running and all that kind of stuff. Even though, obviously, from a humanity standpoint, totally understandable. They're out to, they want you gone.
Right.
You flee for your life. That kind of thing. That's understandable. You'd be kind of scared.
Right. Well, and
But-
yeah, I mean, you look at any of these individuals in Scripture again, and you mentioned it earlier, with the exception of Jesus and God. Every single one of them
yeah.
has their flaws.
Everybody's
Whether those
gonna
were
be flawed.
shown in Scripture, we assume that they were sinners because they were.
And we'll get to sin on a later episode,
Which will be a very
which will be
conversation.
interesting because some of the biblical characters we're going to be bringing up aren't what you would call the quote unquote good guys.
Right. Well, I mean, again, I know before we started recording too, one of the names that came up was David. The man after God's own heart was a very flawed person. You look at Paul before he converted, very flawed person. You know, you see all of these people who they've got skeletons in their closet. You know, they've made mistakes. They've done things that, you know, they aren't proud of. But where was I going? I was building up to something and all of a sudden it zapped out of my brain. You know, they still do their best, I think,
Yeah.
on the whole, to chase after God. Sorry.
I mean, and no one's going to be perfect.
Right.
So that's why this idea of perfection,
Mm-hmm.
holy perfection is not true perfection.
Right.
Because true perfection is only achievable through God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and Jesus is the only one who achieves this total perfection.
Which is what makes these, which is, again, it kind of goes back to that, what we were talking about in the beginning of the episode. These things are hard to grasp. You know, it's not just goodness, but it's all of these other words.
I'll throw out a term, and I'm not going to dive deep into it because I don't want to go in too deep into the theological weeds, but something like entire sanctification, like this process of sanctification, and obviously that's going toward holiness, toward that like goodness ideal. It's a process. It's not something that you can totally achieve.
Yeah.
And it's a process. And obviously maybe my stance on it will be different than, say, the denomination I'm a part of. But my stance is like you can't fully get there.
Mm-hmm.
You get there once you reunite with Jesus in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
That's where totality of perfection comes complete. But I digress. That's going a little bit too deep.
Well, I do want to, it doesn't necessarily have a ton to do with goodness, but you mentioned something, my stance might not agree. That's okay.
Yeah.
Not everybody, you're not always going to agree with what, you know, your church says or what your pastor says or, you know, what the person on the bus next to you says, you know.
Or what this guy says.
Or what this guy says. I mean, but the thing is, and it goes back to something that, you know, I talked about when we were in college with my professors is, are these, you know, salvation issues sort of things.
Yeah.
And again, this is going a little off track from the goodness,
Yeah,
but you mentioned it. And I
Pencil
thought
issues, pen issues, blood issues,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Right. And so it's important to have these conversations because you hear a different perspective. Like I heard today, I heard a different perspective, something that I didn't think about. And it's enlightening because it's like, oh yeah, you do bring up a good point. That's interesting to think about. Because again, you hear the baseline story of the flood and you're like, oh yeah, no, he was a good guy. And then you mention, well, what happened after the flood? Oh, well, there's that. Well, when he talked to anybody else, oh, well, that's good too. Okay, interesting. And all of a sudden your wheels start turning, you start thinking, and maybe you come out with different opinions. Maybe your opinions stay the same. The point is you're having a conversation and you're learning new things, and especially when approaching topics that are faith-based, they can be difficult and complicated, and it's good to hear a bunch of different perspectives. Yeah. But that's my long little spiel on that.
Yeah. So, and I think that brings up something toward goodness as well.
Oh,
Because
he made a connection.
because something that I think really exemplifies goodness is that constant striving and seeking of God's face,
Sure.
or for that holiness and perfection. So there's a striving to learn more. There's a striving to understand more. There's a longing to share. There's a longing to experience the fullness that is that holiness, that goodness. To put it, obviously we're talking about goodness, so but it's this yearning for learning and understanding that I think is really pivotal in how we perceive goodness, and I think what can also drive what we might define as being good. Like often you hear like descriptors like we're good stewards or we're different things like that. So how can we use what we know and what we have to best show like Jesus through ourselves? That's what I think goodness ultimately means, is how can we be the light of Jesus in the midst of who we are? So obviously we're broken people. We have skeletons in our closets. But how can we show that light in the midst of the closet?
Sure. That's
People are going to see the skeletons through that light. But how can we remain showing that light, and doing so while giving credit to God and not us?
That was a really, 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 really good point.
Yeah. So let that sink in for a bit. It also goes with one of my poems that I wrote called Kintsugi.
Hey, this isn't the Inklings.
But
settle down there, soldier.
So if people are interested, you can look up what Kintsugi means. I think it's a good embodiment of what faith should be.
Sure.
And I was coming across it because I was just coming up with. I was researching a lot of things, like I was doing Japanese culture stuff like that. And then lately on like a radio station, I heard like one of the pastors on there talk about Kintsugi. I'm like, oh, I know what that is. I actually thought of this. And he was saying the same stuff. I'm like, oh my gosh. It's like, wow, cool, same brain cell. Awesome. Anyway, I digress.
Is there any other closing thoughts you have regarding goodness?
I know I referred to I know I kind of touched on some of the things with the kindness episode last week. So obviously there is that connection where as this goodness is more this is holiness, this is like the base, and other things flow from it.
Yeah.
So the kindness
is
an
really
aspect of it, just like nice is an aspect of kindness.
Yeah. I think that's a really good way of looking at it. This is kind of the foundational aspect.
So it's good, it's general, but I think general in a way that's actually befitting it, where things are good, but then you get aspects of kindness that flow from goodness, which obviously you get nicety out of it as well. Which is an aspect of kindness. But at the core of it, it's good. It's pleasing. So that's my little add-on, I guess I would say.
And just like that, he's tied a nice little bow across 2 episodes. Good job, Brandon. Kudos to you.
Anyway, what's next week? I don't know what's next
Hey,
week.
it's going to be a surprise. No, he's going to pull out his phone, and then it won't be a surprise.
It's not going to be a surprise. I want you guys to be able to join us as we think of what we're going to do for next week.
We've kind of been doing that for the last few weeks.
So, and I kind of like that idea that you brought up before. So I'm going to be bringing... Let's see what we're actually talking about. I have an idea of what we're talking about. I'm just seeing it. Okay. Oh, yeah, it's a big one. Prayer.
Ooh. So obviously now we're kind of getting into more of a action sort of. This is something you do, but what does that mean?
Well, obviously sin is also going to be a future episode as well. But yeah, we're getting into
this
more
is
of the
kind of the
actions.
start of that. Yeah.
What does this mean? What does this look like? How do I do?
Right. And it's going to be interesting because I think, especially as we do prayer, even when we get into worship, because I know that's coming up eventually, there are, at least in my experience, you've got and I don't want to go too deep because we'll save it for next week, but you've got your generalized, this is what, everybody thinks of as prayer. And then you can obviously go a lot deeper with prayer than what people would initially. It's not just, getting on your hands not your hands, your knees and bowing your head. And
there's different aspects, and I want to go like so much in depth, but I'm not going to, because there's so many things I want to say, but I'm going to save.
Right. So yeah, we'll keep it simple. Keep it easy to understand. But obviously, if you guys want to learn more, let us know. Like, we can go deeper if you want, but
do the KISS model, keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
Kind of,
but
that kind of thing.
If you want to go deeper, please let us know so we know that let's prepare something more.
And let us know down in the comments. We can go deeper in anything that we're talking about.
Right. We will go back to previous episodes and go deeper if you want us to.
So let us know. Obviously, share your descriptions and definitions in the comments down below. We'd love to see them, and we'd love to join you next week as we talk about prayer and what that looks like. So I think that'll be it for this video. Thank you again for watching. This is Discovering Eden. Peace.
Toodles.